Good evening. Good to have you all here this evening. Wanted to take a moment to introduce our speaker, Joey Pontarelli. So as a child of divorce, Joey had started Restored, which is at restoredministry.com, to help teens and young adults from divorced and broken families to heal and build virtue so they can feel whole again and break the cycle of dysfunction and divorce in their own lives. He's spoken across the United States and abroad, including at Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ave Maria University, the Archdiocese of Denver and San Francisco, the Diocese of San Diego, Focus, and more. Joey is the author of the book, It's Not Your Fault. He's been a guest on Relevant Radio's The Drew Mariani Show, EWTN's Women Made New, and Jason Everett's Lust is Boring podcast. Most importantly, Joey is husband to Bridget and father to Lucy. So at this time, we'd like to invite Joey.
Thank you all for being here. I'd like to start with a prayer, so if you join me in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Jesus, we ask you to help us to build healthy relationships and strong marriages. Help us to build holy families, which will transform our culture from the broken culture that it is into a Catholic culture where the human person flourishes and souls are saved. And we ask all this through the intercession of Our Lady as we pray. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. St. John Paul the Great, and Blessed Pure Georgia Frassati. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I remember laying in bed at night, looking up at the ceiling, feeling afraid, with a single question in my mind. I was 14 years old at the time, and I just started liking this great girl. But unlike the serious romances I had in middle school, I wanted this one to actually last. But I was afraid because just a few years prior, my parents separated and later got divorced. And that just shattered my world. It brought so much pain and so many problems into my life. And if someone would have told me the ways in which that event, that trauma, would affect me years later, especially in my relationships and my own marriage, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But laying in bed that night, I was terrified that my relationship with this great girl would one day end the way my parents' marriage had. And so I wanted to know, how do I avoid that? How do I prevent that from happening? How do I not walk down that path? And so the question on my mind was just that. Like, how do I build lasting love? And because I wanted it, I wanted authentic love, but I had no clue how to build it. And I think that's so true for all of us. We all want love, but if we're honest, we're not quite sure how to go about building it. And I think part of the reason for that is because there's not many great examples to look to. I mean, think about it. How many great marriages do you know? Where you would say, I want my marriage to be like their marriage. I know plenty of broken marriages, lots of mediocre marriages, but very few great ones. And it's sad because we're supposed to learn how to love and build relationships and marriages within our families. Our families are supposed to be the school of love, but so often, so many of us come from broken families where we didn't see a great example of it, and as a result, we feel kind of lost. And I think all of this leaves us feeling pretty discouraged, where we give up on love, we give up on relationships, we give up on commitment, give up on marriage, and often we settle for the counterfeit. And I think that's what's happening in our world today. And I think what's needed is a really practical roadmap when it comes to building love that lasts. And so that's what I'll offer in this talk tonight, a really simple roadmap, 7 tips to build healthy relationships and thriving, even divorce-proof marriages. Now, I'm not a marriage expert. I've only been married about 5 years, so I still consider myself a baby husband. So tonight, I'm just the messenger. And so the content in this talk is based on 4 sources. It's based on psychological research, the church's wisdom, time-tested couples, and then where it's helpful, I'll put in my own experience and insights. Don't be fooled by the simplicity of these tips. They're simple, but they're difficult to live. If you put these into action, you will have a healthy relationship and a strong marriage. This talk is for anyone who wants love. Whether you're single, dating, engaged, or married, it's for you. And a big welcome to anyone watching online as well. I just wanted to acknowledge you guys there. This isn't a chastity talk. I typically give this talk to like college-age young adults. Chastity talks are so important. One of them changed my life. I heard Jason Everett speak years ago. It was really influential for me. Super important message. And it's important to live the virtue of chastity in our relationships, but I like to think of the virtue of chastity as the foundation of a home. There's more to build above the surface. And so if you live the virtue of chastity in your relationship, it's not a guarantee of a great marriage, even though it's an essential part. And so we want to talk about everything above the foundation tonight, all those other things that we need to do to have a beautiful relationship. We're not going to talk about contraception or cohabitation. If you want a great resource for what the church teaches on contraception, Jason Everett is the master on that. He has a booklet and a talk by the name of Pure Intimacy. You can check those out at chastity.com. When it comes to cohabitation, honestly, you could just research this yourself. I assume a lot of you already know this. Don't live together before the wedding. Studies have found that if you live together before the wedding, you're 50 to 80% more likely to get divorced. And my wife and I, we didn't live together during engagement, during dating. And one day she was at work, she's a nurse, she was just sharing this. It came up in conversation that we didn't live together. And one of the nurses looked at her kind of perplexed, and she said, "So once you're married, will you live together then?" I wish my wife would have said, "Nope, separate homes, separate bedrooms, the whole thing." A little confusion there. Also, this is not a theology talk, right? Father's more competent when it comes to theology. We're going to focus on the really human stuff because one of my mentors says that we tend to over-spiritualize marriage. And that sounds kind of odd because marriage is a sacrament, right? It is spiritual. But again, I think where marriages often break down is on the human level, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. So with that, let's dive in. Tip number 1, build virtue. If you want a great marriage, it starts with you. It has nothing to do with your relationship. That sounds kind of odd. Why is that? It's really simple. You, and eventually your spouse, are the lid on your marriage. Your marriage will only be as happy, healthy, and holy as each of you are individually. And what I've seen in the great marriages that I've known is the more virtuous the spouses, the happier the marriage. Always. The more virtuous the spouses, the happier the marriage. It's really as simple as that. We can probably end the talk right now. But how do you build virtue? The Catechism actually gives us a great 4-part framework. Catechism says that to build virtue, we need education, deliberate acts, perseverance in those acts, and of course, God's grace. God's grace, we need to flood our souls with God's grace. God's grace is obviously His life within us. We need to deepen our interior lives and build intimacy with God, especially through personal prayer. And in your fight against virtue and to build vice, make sure that you're truly relying on God, because I believe that God will provide for you to the degree that you rely on Him. And so rely on Him greatly. When it comes to education, we need to learn the virtues in order to live them. To do that, I want to recommend 3 great books. Perhaps you've read 1 or 2 of them. The first is Back to Virtue by Peter Kreeft. Back to Virtue by Peter Kreeft. Atomic Habits by James Clear, Atomic Habits. And The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit. To build virtue, in that book, Atomic Habits, the author talks about the 4 parts of a habit. It's really helpful to understand if we want to build virtue. The first is the cue or the trigger, you could say. The cue or the trigger. Next is the craving. From there is the behavior or the routine. And fourth is the reward. So take the example of eating fast food. The cue is that I feel hungry. The craving is that I crave food, crave a particular type of food like a hamburger. The behavior is buying the food and eating the food. And the reward, of course, is that it tastes good, I feel full, and my body hopefully gets some nutrients. Now, to change that habit, I can't actually stop. Can't go cold turkey. To change a habit, you have to just replace it. Now, you can't change the cue. You can't stop yourself from feeling hungry. And you can't stop the craving necessarily, at least not right away. And so what you need to do is change the behavior to substitute new behavior that offers a similar reward. And so in the example of eating fast food, I would eat healthy food that also tasted good, do that for a time, and then that habit would be integrated into my character. Now, there's so many barriers when it comes to growth, but one of the main ones that I've realized is our untreated brokenness. What I've realized is that after sin, the thing that holds us back most from becoming the best version of ourselves is our untreated brokenness. And so if you want a great marriage, healing isn't optional. It's required. In fact, those of you who are married or in dating relationships, perhaps you've realized that within those relationships, especially within marriage, your brokenness tends to surface. I've certainly experienced that myself. And so trying to build a great marriage without healing is like trying to run a marathon on a broken foot. Unless you're David Goggins, you're probably not going to be able to do that. And the danger is that if we don't heal, we're going to pass our brokenness onto the people that we love the most. Now, does that mean you need to be a canonized saint in order to get married? Well, no, but we want to remove any serious impediments that prevent us from loving in a free way, like an addiction or something like that. And so I'll recommend a resource at the end when it comes to healing. But tip number 1, build virtue. Tip number 2, find a virtuous spouse or help your spouse to build virtue. What sort of virtues are important to marriage? What should you look for in a spouse? A few of these virtues. 1, the virtue of chastity. We hear about chastity a lot. Why is it so important? Because at the core of chastity is self-mastery. And self-mastery is essential. It's an essential ingredient if you want a great marriage, because it gives you the ability to deny yourself, to sacrifice for your marriage and for your family. It's also important because lust will destroy your marriage. I've seen it time and time again. Infidelity is one of the top causes of divorce. Find someone who's humble. Humility is the foundation of all the virtues, but it's so helpful within a marriage because it gives you the ability to apologize and to forgive, and that happens a lot. You can ask my wife. She's a pro at forgiveness because I mess up a lot. Find someone who's empathetic, who has the virtue of empathy, because that gives them the ability to see things through your eyes, and this is super helpful, especially in the midst of conflict, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Find someone who has a growth mindset. A growth mindset is basically the ability, you believe that you can change and you can grow. You have the ability to change and grow. You're not stuck. You're not the same. Find someone who has a growth mindset. Why is that important? Because you don't just marry the person that they are today, you marry the person that they will become. And one of the greatest indications of who they will become is their attitude and actions towards growth. And so pay attention to that. Find someone who gets you. Now, I'm not sure men and women will ever quite get each other, but certainly, there's some people in your life who you're better friends with than others. And so build that friendship. That friendship is so important because marriage is so much more than just romance and sex. In fact, it can be said that the quality of marriage is perhaps best measured by the quality of the friendship between the spouses, not their romance or sex life or their feelings. Those are all good and important things, but they're not the ultimate measure of love. Find someone who you want your children to be like. You can just ask that question, hey, do I want my kids to be like this man or this woman? Find someone who's on the same page in 4 areas. Researchers have found that if you're on the same page, if you believe the same thing and have a plan in life on these 4 areas, your success likeliness for having a happy marriage, a successful marriage, goes way up. Those 4 areas are this: God, money, parenting, and in-laws. God, money, parenting, and in-laws. That last one can kind of sneak up on you a little bit. No, I have great in-laws. But in all of this, when it comes to dating, I think it's super helpful to have a list of qualities, of virtues that you want in a spouse. I think it helps you to stay objective. But just make sure, especially all you young people here, make sure you separate that list into 2 parts. One, the non-negotiables, the must-haves, the really important things. And then the second one are, the nice-to-haves, like having a Ferrari or something like that, being foreign. And then you can compare the person you're dating to this list and say, are these things true about them? But when you're discerning, be very careful. John Paul II said that when we're in love, we tend to, he didn't say we tend to, he said we always actually exaggerate the goodness and the virtue of the person that we love. As a rule, he said, it happens to all of us. And so we need to be brutally honest. Is this person actually virtuous? And we can't discern that alone because we all know that love is blinding. And so we need to involve people in our life and who can help us discern. So involve your family, involve your friends, ask them for feedback. Ask them if they see any red flags in your relationship. And don't wait for them to give you feedback. I made this mistake in a lot of my relationships. Seek that feedback out. And I'm sure you have some friends who just want to give you feedback anyway, even if you don't ask for it. But seek that out. It's going to save you a lot of heartache. I wish that I had done this sooner in a lot of my relationships. It's kind of scary to get the answers that you might hear, but it will save you a lot of heartache. But most of all, pursue someone who's pursuing God. Curtis Martin said it best. He said, "Don't pursue your soulmate, pursue God. And after a while of running after him, turn to see who's keeping up with you." Now, what about any of you here who are engaged or married? How do you help your spouse to build virtue? I think the first thing we need to remember is that people can change, but you can't change them. People can change, but you can't change them. I learned this the hard way early on in marriage. My wife and I really struggled in talking about money. And so we bought the Dave Ramsey course and tried to do that, but we were never able to even start it or get through it. And she didn't really want to do it. It was really frustrating to me as a business nerd and a finance major. And so I'd try hard to convince her, like, we need to do this, like a lawyer, right? I'd lawyer up and try to convince her, like, this is why we need to do this, try to coerce her. And then genius here eventually realized, this approach isn't really working. And so I started to use some influence tactics. Didn't do all this perfectly at first, but I tried to, use the slow and strategic approach, asking good questions, improving the relationship, sharing little pieces of content like an article, a podcast, a video, a meme. And then share with her why this is so important to me, why it's important that we get on the same page when it comes to our finances and getting everything together so we can be financially free. And then give her the freedom to choose. Again, I did some of these things, not all of them perfectly, but it did work. And we're in a much better spot. In fact, she probably loves Dave Ramsey more than I do now. And so, again, people can change, but you can't change them. You can influence them. And the best way to influence them, we've learned this from the 12-step programs, is just to focus on your own growth, because they'll see you thriving, they'll see you doing well, they'll want what you have, and that motivating force of them wanting something is much better than anything that's going to come out of your mouth. And so tip 2, find a virtuous spouse or help your spouse to build virtue. Tip 3, purify your idea of love. Marriage researchers have found that this is an essential ingredient for a great marriage, a realistic concept of love. In other words, knowing the truth about love. Because in our culture, so often, we're taught lies about love. And some of the lies that I fell into, one of them is believing that love doesn't last. That even if it's good for a time, eventually it will crash and burn. It's going to fall apart. And seeing my parents' marriage fall apart, seeing them get divorced, I certainly believe this on a deep level. And even if other people could have successful marriages, I really doubted that it was possible for me. But the truth I learned is that love can last. Marriage can last. It can be so good and so beautiful. It's been proven to me by 2 couples in my life especially. They just have really beautiful marriages where I want my marriage to be like their marriage. And their example, their beautiful love has given me hope that love can last, but especially it's taught me by their example how I can go about doing that myself. And so I hope you have couples like that in your life. Even if you've been married a while, I hope you have couples that you can look up to as well, who can prove to you that love can last, especially if you come from a divorced or broken family where you didn't see the greatest model growing up. And love can also last because we can choose to make it last. Another lie is that feelings equal love. Like when I was younger, I certainly knew this wasn't true on an intellectual level, but subconsciously, I certainly believed this, that feelings were the measure of love. More feeling, more love. Less feeling, less love. And so in my relationships, I'd actually get really anxious when feelings would start to subside or to change. I thought, is love ending? And so the truth that I needed to learn to purify my idea of love is what John Paul II taught. He said, love is not merely a feeling. It is an act of the will that consists of choosing in a constant manner the good of the beloved to the good of oneself. And so feelings are a part of love, but they're only a part, and they're certainly not the measure of authentic love. And so in your dating relationships, in your marriages, when feelings fade, don't freak out. Your love is not doomed. It's actually an invitation to a deeper, more mature love. And it's actually a good thing if you think about it. It forces you to choose, what do I love more, the feelings or the person? And so I do think, in a dating relationship, if you never had any romantic feelings toward the person, probably is an issue. But it's really important that we don't decide on emotion alone. Like, when in life is it a good idea to make decisions on emotion alone? And the real danger, I think, here is that, if we judge our relationships in our marriages based on emotion alone, we might be tempted to walk away from something that's really good and beautiful because we're not feeling it. In fact, one study asked people who were divorced, like, why did you get divorced? And one woman said this. She said, I realized it was the lack of commitment on my part because I really didn't feel romantic toward him. I always felt like he was more of a friend to me. How tragic. Like, obviously, their romance needed a spark, but how sad to leave your marriage because you didn't feel romantic. Another lie is that love is too risky. It's not worth the possible hurt. It's true that if you love, you'll probably be hurt. But you know what's worse, more dangerous than being hurt? Not loving at all. C.S. Lewis said it so well. He said this. He said, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and the luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. And so the danger is that our hearts would become hard. And the truth that I learned is love is worth the risk. Yes, there's pain involved, but if you work at it, the good can far outweigh the pain, the bad. And in your relationships, when you choose to love, to put your heart out there, again, you may be hurt, but your life won't get easier. I have to say that, but it will get better. It has the potential to get so much better. And if you struggle here, I get it. In high school, college, I was really paralyzed by fear of love, by fear of being hurt, by fear of repeating what I saw in my parents' marriage. I was afraid to date. I was afraid to pursue women. But in time, one of the things that helped me was to practice vulnerability in my friendships in little ways. And in time, I was able to do that in dating relationships. I was able to pursue women one at a time. And I was able to eventually pursue my spouse. We get married, and now we're building our family. We have a baby in heaven, one here on earth. And it's really, really beautiful. And so if that's you, if you feel that fear, I would just encourage you to take baby steps toward choosing to love. And I'm amazed that, by God's grace, I was able to work my way through that. And so do it scared, do it gradually, and don't expect your fear to disappear. If you're afraid of love and relationships, don't expect it to disappear. Act scared, act in spite of it, and that's how you overcome your fear. And if you have to go slower, that's okay. So my challenge here is to purify your idea of love. One exercise you can do is just make a quick list of what you believe. Again, a lot of this is subconscious, so it takes some digging, what you believe about love. And once you identify those lies, you can learn the truth and suffocate those lies with the truth. And so what lies do you subconsciously believe about love? Tip 3, purify your idea of love. Tip 4, set healthy expectations for your marriage. Perhaps you've heard of the Paris syndrome. It's a psychological phenomenon, condition where when tourists go to Paris, France, they suffer extreme shock, disappointment, and other symptoms to the point where they need to go home or get medical attention. This is not a joke. It's been documented by medical journalists. So what in the world is going on here? Basically, the messy reality of Paris, France, did not live up to the unrealistic expectations that these tourists have, and then they suffered because of it. Similarly, if our expectations for marriage are off, we're going to struggle. It'll cause a lot of problems. And so to fix those unhealthy expectations, we first have to identify what they are. I want to mention 2 really popular unhealthy expectations in our culture. One is believing that the purpose of marriage is happiness. The purpose of marriage is not happiness. The purpose of marriage is holiness. Nowhere in the wedding vows is happiness promised. I know that sounds super romantic, especially on Valentine's Day, but it's so true and it's so important because underneath almost every divorce is this belief. Consciously or not, we expect our spouse to make us perfectly happy, and when they don't, we tend to think, maybe I married the wrong person. Maybe I chose the wrong vocation, and we might even be tempted to leave. And so your marriage will suffer to the extent that you expect your spouse to make you perfectly happy. Only God can do that. Fulton Sheen wrote about this a lot. Now, does that mean there's no place for happiness within marriage? No, of course there is. It's really good and beautiful to make your spouse happy, to experience all the joy that comes with marriage. But don't be fooled. Marriage is hard work. It doesn't show up in a prime box. We've been so conditioned in our culture that when we want something, we hit a button, and in a few days, it shows up. Not so with marriage. Marriage is more like farming. It takes time to see the fruit of your labor. But we all know that the best things in life require work. Like, ask any Navy SEAL or Olympic gold medalist who's just reached that level, like, how did you do it? They didn't do it by sitting on the couch and watching Netflix, right? They showed up every day, especially when they didn't feel like it. If we want great marriages, why should we expect any less? Another really popular area of unhealthy expectations is around sex. There's a few things to this. One is around frequency. Like, you don't have sex all the time. Any married couple knows this, but I think those who aren't married might have that expectation. And so it's helpful to understand that going into marriage. One of you typically will have a higher sex drive than the other, and that naturally will cause some tension. Now, typically it's the man who has the higher sex drive, but not always. But that's going to cause some tension, some conflict within your marriage, and so be patient when it comes to figuring out sex. Give it time, months, years, and that time it will improve. It has for a lot of couples. I know it has for my wife and I. Sex isn't the same for men and women. John Paul II actually wrote about this pretty extensively in Love and Responsibility. Sex is not the same for men and women. It's corny, but it's helpful to remember that men are like microwaves, we're turned on quickly, and women are like crock pots. It takes a little bit of time. But John Paul II, again, he wrote about this, and he said that men in particular, we need to master ourselves and kind of align our sexual nature with that of the woman, which takes, again, a lot of self-mastery. He admitted it's really, really difficult. It's impossible, what he said, without goodwill on the part of the man. When it comes to natural family planning, be prepared. It's challenging. It's really challenging. Sometimes I've seen it glamorized in the Catholic world. If you're not familiar with natural family planning, it is basically a natural way to space births without contraception. It's good contracepting. So basically, you're always open to another baby, but if you're avoiding, if you've discerned that now's not the right time for us to get pregnant, you'd abstain from having sex during fertile times. And some of my friends, I remember some of my guy friends saying, oh, that's just like 3 days of the month, easy. Well, no, depending on the woman, it can be up to a week and a half to 2 weeks. It takes self-mastery. And there might be medical reasons that you need to abstain from sex within marriage, too. My wife and I, we had a miscarriage early on, and so the doctors told us, you got to abstain from sex for at least 6 weeks. I've known couples who had to wait months, and one couple who had to wait a year because the wife had been sexually abused, and there's just a lot of that trauma resurfacing for her, and so it was a really difficult time for her, of course, but also for her husband. And so just be prepared. I don't say that to freak anyone out who's not married. There's really, it's really beautiful. But there can be some challenging times. And so don't expect it to be magical all the time. It does require self-mastery. But I think the two things that have really damaged our expectations of sex is porn and movies. How do I put it? Our sex lives will not look like The Notebook. They won't look like porn, thank God. But if we expect that, consciously or not, our marriage will suffer. And don't hear me wrong, again, sex is good and beautiful, but it's not like porn and not like the movies. And one tip to set healthy expectations for marriage, again, is to build relationships with good couples, spending time with their families if you can, spending a time around their kids, just kind of soaking in the reality of what a marriage is actually like so that in our heads we don't create some sort of fairy tale and then our own marriages don't live up to that and we become disappointed. Tip number 4, set healthy expectations for your marriage. Tip 5, learn to handle conflict. This is so important. One author said that the conflict is the price you pay for intimacy. Conflict is the price you pay for intimacy. It's so true because when you get close to someone, you can't avoid conflict. And if you do, it's usually a sign that you're either saints or something's off. And so the goal is not to eliminate conflict, but just to make conflict healthy. And no one knows more than this than Dr. John Gottman. He and his team of researchers have been researching this topic for over 30 years. They study married couples and conflict, and supposedly they can predict with up to 95% accuracy whether the couple will get divorced or stay married. And they're looking for 4 bad signs. When they study a couple, they invite them to their lab, which looks like an apartment out on the West Coast, I think in Seattle. And they're looking for 4 bad signs. They call it the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And they typically happen in this order: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. I'll go into each of these. Criticism. Psychologists say that criticism and complaining are different. Complaining is saying something negative about someone's actions, whereas criticism is attacking that person, attacking their character. Contempt is similar to criticism, but different. Dr. Gottman says that contempt is the intention to insult and psychologically harm your spouse, your partner. And what that looks like, he says, is name-calling, sarcasm, and mockery. Defensiveness really is the result of the former two, of criticism and contempt. When we feel attacked, it's only natural that we put our shield up. We get defensive. And that looks like blaming, making excuses, and being unwilling to take responsibility. And then finally, stonewalling. When we're so overwhelmed, we just tend to shut down. We become emotionless. We avoid our spouse. We kind of check out of the marriage. And so if you see these 4 signs in your marriage is not doomed. If these become habits, though, you're pretty much heading off of a cliff, and you need professional help now. So if those are the bad ways to handle conflict, what are the good ways to handle conflict? How do we handle conflict well? 3 tips from the awesome book, Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. The first one is learn to pick your battles. Pick your battles. Learn to let, basically, the small things go. Give grace in those situations. This is so helpful. It has been for me because my wife just makes a lot of mistakes. No, I'm just kidding. I'm definitely worse than her. But you don't need to voice everything, right? You don't need to voice everything that you dislike or everything that annoys you about your spouse. You can learn to let it go and just live with those small things. Obviously, if it's something big, you need to bring that up. But those small things, you can let them go. You can let those small fires burn, so to speak. Another tip is to practice empathy. Like, place yourself intentionally in their shoes. To do that, you need to detach from your own emotions. Sometimes we can get really worked up in conflict. Not sometimes. When there is conflict, we get really worked up. And so we need to detach from those emotions. One tactic that psychologists recommend is repeating back what you hear your spouse saying to you so that you make sure that you really understand them, that you're on the same page. And then the final tip is take a break. Take a break. Our marriage counselor, my wife and I have been to marriage counseling, he taught us this. He said that, when things get intense, you could call a timeout. So before a conflict even happens, in advance, you set a time for your timeout. Whether it's 30 minutes or 24 hours, that's typically the range you want to aim for. And in conflict, one of you can say, timeout. Like, I need a break, we need a break. And that's so helpful because, and then, oh, by the way, the person who calls timeout, they're the one who keeps track of the time and they resume the conversation. It's so helpful because when we're in conflict, when we're emotional, when we're angry especially, our IQ drops by about 30 points. So for those of us like me who with an average IQ, we drop down to 70, which is the range of mental disability. And so you're not going to really solve much in those conflicts at that level, so you need to take a break. So if you want more tips like this, I highly recommend the book Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. It's written by Drs. Les and Leslie Parrott. It's a man and woman, a husband and wife couple. One's a psychologist, one's a marriage and family therapist. They both have the same name. It's hilarious. But lots of good stuff in there. And then obviously put these tips into practice. You're not going to master them right away like playing a sport or playing an instrument. You need to practice again and again and again. So tip 5, learn to handle conflict. Tip 6, love your spouse how they want to be loved. In the book, The 5 Love Languages, Dr. Gary Chapman says that each of us has a very real emotional need to be loved. And more than anything, we want our spouse to love us. We want to feel loved by them. And when we do, life is great. The world is beautiful. When we don't, the world is dark. Things are hard. And he says this in the book. He says, in the context of marriage, if we do not feel loved, our differences are magnified. We come to view each other as a threat to our happiness. We fight for self-worth and significance, and marriage becomes a battlefield rather than a haven. He uses the metaphor, he says, inside each person is this emotional tank waiting to be filled with love. And when we feel loved, that tank is full. When we feel unloved or rejected, that tank is empty. And when problems occur, it's usually because that tank is empty. That's often at the root of it within a marriage. And so the goal is to keep your spouse's emotional tank full and teach your spouse how to fill yours. And really the best tool for doing this is the 5 love languages. You've probably heard of it. Maybe you know your own love languages. Have you read the book perhaps? But if you're unaware, Dr. Gary Chapman is a marriage counselor, and after working with hundreds of couples, helping them overcome a lot of the issues in their marriage, he just realized, he saw this trend that not everyone wanted to be loved the same way. People wanted to be loved in different ways. And so he tested and refined his ideas, and that became the 5 love languages, the very popular book. He sold over 10 million copies. It's helped a lot of people, a lot of couples. And if you're unaware of the love languages, there's 5 of them. Words of affirmation, acts of service, gifts, quality time, and physical touch. And often we love in the way that's just natural to us or the way that we want to be loved. But the danger there is that that doesn't mean that that's the way that our spouse wants to be loved. And as a result, they might feel unloved. Their tank will be empty. And if that persists for long enough, they might go seek other ways to fill it. And often that can become unhealthy. In the book, he tells so many stories of spouses who just wanted to feel loved, to feel appreciated, and so they pursued affairs and other really unhealthy behaviors. And so this is serious. This is not some neat tool that middle school girls geek over. Like, this is a serious thing. This is a really important topic. And so it's an essential skill within a marriage. And to grow in this area, my challenge is this. If you're not aware of your love languages, take the assessment online. You can go to 5lovelanguages.com, 5lovelanguages.com, the word or the number, either works. Buy the book if you want to, and then put it into action. Live them out daily, practice. So tip 6, love your spouse how they want to be loved. Tip 7, make things right. Don't just fix things that go wrong. I mentioned that my wife and I have gone to marriage counseling early on in marriage, especially. We were just struggling to handle conflict well. We didn't know how to navigate all that. I didn't really see a great example of that growing up. And so we go to counseling, right? And I expected the counselor to tell us, like, well, here's some tactics to resolve conflict. Like, do this, say that. But that's not what he did. Instead, he wanted to know about the health of our marriage. He said, are you having deep conversations? Are you having fun together? Are you going on dates? Because what he wanted was not just to treat the symptoms, but to treat the root cause. And it reminded me of a really valuable lesson from the great book, The Anatomy of Peace. In that book, the authors say this. They say, we have to spend more time and energy making things go right than fixing things that go wrong. What do they mean? It's simple. Instead of waiting for your heart to fail and getting heart surgery, keep your heart healthy. Instead of fixing a blown-up engine, do periodic maintenance on your car. It's simple, right? It's a simple, but it's a difficult lesson because the struggle is one in those small daily habits. And so how do you make things go right? I want to just offer 5 tips that psychologists say and spiritual directors, wise people smarter than me. One is to pray together, right? Obviously make use of the sacraments, but go beyond that. Like, I would especially challenge you guys, do heartfelt prayer. Build that spiritual intimacy. Go beyond just the rote formulaic prayers. Play together. Go on weekly dates. I think the saying is so true that the couple that prays together and plays together stays together. Do a weekly business meeting. Our counselor taught us this one too. So, a 30 to 60-minute meeting where you're handling all the logistical stuff so that all those things don't invade your dates and your time together. And what my wife and I do in that weekly meeting is we look at our schedule for the next week. We look at different priorities, things we want to get done. We talk about our daughter, things like that. And it just helps us to get on the same page and avoid a lot of missing each other or tension during the week or constantly focusing on those conversations outside of that meeting. For those of you who are married or will be married one day, in your marriage, make sure you prioritize your sex life. This is so important, and you don't really need to tell men to prioritize their sex life, so ladies might need to hear this a little bit more, but it's so important because it's essential to a healthy marriage. And a great book on this topic, based on Catholic principles, is Holy Sex by Dr. Greg Popchak, Holy Sex. It's based on love and responsibility. Lots of good practical advice in that one. And then finally, be vulnerable, even if it's scary. One of the temptations within marriage is that you'd close off your heart. Your heart would become hard. You'll no longer be vulnerable. But vulnerability truly is the foundation of any sort of intimacy. And John Paul II, he says that the number one thing missing in marriage is actually tenderness. And so we need to keep our hearts tender. And the reason that's such a temptation, by the way, in marriage is because you hurt each other. And so it's going to be easy to harden your heart and to close out your spouse. And so you need to be intentional about being vulnerable. And so my challenge is this, build that strong foundation. Put more time, energy, money, effort into making things go right instead of just fixing things that go wrong. And that's tip number 7. Certainly more can be said about these topics, but I hope these tips, these simple tips, offer a roadmap to build healthy relationships and a strong, great marriage. But perhaps the most important thing I can say to any of you here tonight, any of you watching, is this. Be prepared for the temptation to quit. Be prepared for the temptation to quit. It's not a popular thing to say, but it's so important. Be prepared. Expect things to get difficult. Expect things to go wrong. Expect days or seasons within your marriage where you just don't want to be married, where you want to leave, if you're like most couples. And in those times, don't be scandalized by what I'm saying to you. In those times, don't quit. Don't listen to what the world has to say. In those times, and especially right now, don't be scandalized. Because, think about it. Why do we make a vow? If we were never tempted to quit, the vow wouldn't be necessary. Desire alone would hold the marriage together. And so when you struggle, when friends of yours struggle in their marriages, don't believe the lie that there are only 2 options: to get divorced and be happy, or stay married and be miserable. Thankfully, there's a third option. You can heal your marriage. How do you do that? First, we just need to ask for help. We can't fix a broken marriage alone. We need a mentor, couple, and marriage counselor. Even if your spouse isn't willing to go to marriage counseling, go yourself. A Catholic counselor is best, but you want to find someone who's competent as well. Just because they're Catholic doesn't make them competent, so make sure you find a good one. Rely on friends and resources that will encourage you to stay true to your wedding vows. There's a lot out there that will just encourage you, again, to walk away, even in the Catholic world, unfortunately. And 2 resources I just want to mention for you in the future, for any of your friends who are struggling in their marriages. The first one is the book Marriage 911. Greg and Julie Alexander wrote that book. Their story is incredible. Their marriage was on its last thread. Their marriage was on its last thread. They both were cheating on each other. When that all came to light, it just exploded. And they both wanted to get divorced. And so they were pursuing that route when they met a priest. And this priest really challenged them. He said, what's the purpose of marriage? What did God have in mind when he invented this thing? And so through that process, they really discovered God's plan for marriage. They started to live that out, and it rescued their marriage, and it saved their children a lot of pain, a lot of heartache. And now they coach struggling marriages through their organization, the Alexander House. And they've helped over 5,000 couples in the past 20 years, and their success rate, I kid you not, is 98%. 98%. And so check out their book, Marriage 911. You can just Google the Alexander House. Great resource for struggling couples. Another resource is the book Impossible Marriages Redeemed, written by Layla Miller. Impossible Marriages Redeemed. The subtitle is They Didn't End the Story in the Middle. Bishop Olmsted, of the previous bishop of the Phoenix Diocese, he asked Layla to write this book. He said, I want a book to give to my priests when they're counseling married couples, because we need to know that really messy, broken marriages can be redeemed. And so there's 50 stories of broken marriages that were rescued, that were redeemed. And these stories are going to blow you away if you read this book. Super, super messy, difficult situations, like infidelity, all sorts of crazy things you would never expect that these marriages could be redeemed. And so there's so much hope in Impossible Marriages Redeemed. Toward the end of our time together, though, I wanted to share pieces of an exhortation that used to be read to Catholic couples at their weddings. It's kind of long, but it's really beautiful. Bear with me here. This union, then, is most serious because it will bind you together for life in a relationship so close and so intimate that it will influence and direct your entire future from this day forward. That future, with its hopes and disappointments, its successes and failures, its pleasures and its pains, its joys and sorrows, is hidden from your eyes. Not knowing what is before you, you take each other for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health until death. Truly then, these words are most serious. Whatever sacrifices you may hereafter be required to make to preserve this mutual life, always make them generously. Sacrifice is difficult and trying. Only love can make it easy, and perfect love can make it a joy. If you allow true love and the unselfish spirit of perfect sacrifice to guide your every action, you can expect the greatest measure of earthly happiness that may be allotted to us in this vale of tears. The rest is in God's hands. Be assured that God will not fail you in your needs. God pledges you the lifelong support of his graces in the holy sacrament, which you are now going to minister to one another. And in closing, I think you'd agree that our world is very broken. So how do we fix our broken world? Two things. One, we need saints. We need to become saints. Saints always transform the world. Next, we need great marriages and holy families. John Paul II said that as the family goes, so goes the nation, and so goes the whole world in which we live. Another way to say it is that our culture will always reflect the condition of the marriages and the families within it. And so to fix society, we need holy families. Holy families are built upon strong marriages, and strong marriages are built upon healthy, whole, and virtuous people, individuals. And so if we do that, I truly believe that we will transform our culture from a broken culture into a Catholic culture where the human person flourishes and souls are saved, and there's nothing more important. And so I want to leave you with this challenge. What's just one thing in this talk that resonated with you? Make a plan to just act on it this week. And if my ministry, which Father introduced at the beginning, can serve you in any way, I'd be more than happy to help. Again, we help teenagers and young adults who come from divorced or broken families to heal and build virtue so they can feel whole again and break that cycle of dysfunction and divorce in their own lives. And two resources I just want to mention. One is our podcast. It's the top podcast for young people from broken families. People who aren't from broken families will also find it helpful as well. We just have amazing interviews on there. We've hit over 50,000 downloads at this point. In the back, there are cards. If you scan the QR code, you can get access to the podcast. We do have a love and relationships series on there as well. We brought in experts and we interviewed them. If you want to find that, just go to restoredministry.com, restored ministry singular /love series. And then finally, the book that I wrote, I humbly recommend this for any of you who come from broken families or you know someone who does, maybe you love or lead someone who does. The book is titled, It's Not Your Fault, A Practical Guide to Navigating the Pain and Problems from Your Parents' Divorce. And the book features 33 questions and answers on the most pressing challenges faced by young people from broken families. And one young woman said this. She said, I bought this book for someone very close to me who was going through their parents' divorce as a young adult. It really, really helped him and was a major turning point in his healing journey. Highly recommend. I'm so glad this is a resource. So we're selling those books in the back for $10, and then for any of you watching the recording, you can just go to restoredministry.com and buy the book there through Amazon. So now we're going to do a little Q&A, but I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for investing your time. I hope it was helpful. I hope this helps you to build healthy relationships and strong and even divorce-proof marriages. Count on my prayers, and God bless you all. So yeah, we'll open it up. Any questions? Not all at once. Yeah, Ted. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'll try to give some general pointers, and then I know without knowing the full context, it could be difficult because I know there's a lot of ins and outs in it. One thing I think is just, again, like I was saying during the talk, if there's any chance of healing the marriage, healing the family, and bringing it back together, those resources I mentioned I think are so, so helpful. And maybe it's too far gone at this point where it's not possible. That's always the hope, though. That's what the Catechism says. That's what canon law says, is the hope always, even when there's serious problems within marriage, hopefully we can resolve those problems and bring the family and the marriage back together. We live in a broken world. That's not always possible, though. And so one of the things I think, I'm no expert when it comes to divorced people. We focus more on the young adults who come from families where the parents are divorced. But I think one of the biggest things, this is what I say to any parents who are trying to help their kids, and I think it applies in this case too, is just your empathy, your acknowledgement of what they're going through, their pain. I'm sure you've done that well already. But one grief expert says that so often when we try to help people who are in pain, we want to like take their pain away from them. I know I have that tendency. When you see someone in pain that you love, you don't want them to be in pain. You want to take away their pain. You want to cheer them up. And she says that that's actually not the best way to help them feel better. It sounds kind of odd, she says, but to help them feel better, you actually need to let them be in that emotional pain and just be with them in the midst of that pain. And she said that being heard especially helps. And so validating their experience, giving that empathy, saying I would feel that way too if I was in your shoes. Like, I'm so sorry you've been through that. You want to talk about it. And she says just listening can go such a long way, and it will make things better even when they can't be made right, because these situations are just so messy. So I applaud you for trying to continue those friendships and love them. I'm sure that's really impacted you, but I think that's really beautiful. And I think another thing, being a married man yourself, is just trying to live out your own marriage in a beautiful way. That maybe that would be some sort of inspiration for them, either whether they rejoin or restart the marriage with their spouse, which does happen. Like in that book I mentioned, there was one story of just a horrible marriage. Like the husband had cheated on the wife multiple times, just a lot of dysfunction within the marriage. But years down the road, after they had had multiple children, the husband had a huge conversion. It was quite insane. And they eventually got back together. They continued their marriage. And now they're thriving. They have a really beautiful marriage. And I spoke to the author about their story, and she said that all their children now have really beautiful marriages as well. They're all thriving. I'm sure there's struggles here or there, but they're all doing well. So I think there's something to be said for that as well, that it can be redeemed. But I think that empathy really goes far. Does that help?
It does.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you for the 7 tips, too.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And sorry, I didn't repeat the first question, but I'll just repeat it basically. So for children who are kind of torn between their parents because mom or dad want them to be loyal or pick their side, happens a ton. In fact, the Catechism actually talks about that. The Catechism says, talking about divorce, it says, divorce essentially brings grave harm to the deserted spouse, to children traumatized by the separation of their parents, and often torn between them. And so it's such a real thing. What I would say is, one thing you could tell your parents, I've told my parents this, is like, mom or dad may no longer be your spouse, but they're still my mom and my dad. And so I need you to respect that. And those can be some hard conversations to have. But I think it's a good reminder. And one of the questions I've asked my parents is like, hey, imagine you're me. Place yourself in my shoes. If your mom or your dad was saying this about the other, how would you feel? And usually that helps them to realize, well, okay, yeah, I wouldn't like that. And so they might stop. But it can be tricky because there's a lot of heavy emotions. Parents, I'm a parent, I'm very imperfect. But I think so often when emotions get heavy, when mom and dad are going at each other in a divorce situation, it can get very toxic, very dramatic. And so, again, I think healthy boundaries are needed. That's one thing I always encourage young people to do, is like set those healthy boundaries and then enforce them, because it takes time. The first time it might not go super smoothly, telling mom or dad like, hey, I don't want you to badmouth mom around me, dad, or I don't want you to badmouth dad around me, mom. So please just don't talk about mom or dad around me. And so I think communicating that is really good, and just making it more about you than about them, saying like, hey, it's really hard for me when you say those things about the other parent. And so would you please just keep that to yourself. If you need to go vent, call your brother, your sister, cousin, counselor, pastor, lawyer, counselor, whatever, someone else, not me. So I found that helpful. But the book that I wrote has some tips in there on that too. Does that help? Okay, sorry. Any other questions? Yeah.
How would you say you were successful in my house? I know you said like 30 minutes
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question is, in setting that time out that I talked about, what's the ideal or optimal time? I think it depends on the couple. Like, if you're Italian like me, you probably need like 5 days. No, I'm just kidding. But if you're a little more, passionate, you might need a little bit more time. Because after like 30 minutes or an hour, it might not be enough. You might be like more pent up than you were before. So I think you need to know yourself, know your spouse, and just try to figure out what would be an adequate time. And so I think ideally it's not going to take 24 hours. Ideally it's going to be towards the front of that, 30 minutes, 1 hour or so. So I think you can experiment, just try like set it at 30 minutes. That doesn't work, change it to an hour. That doesn't work, change it to an hour and a half, 2 hours. So I think it does depend on the personality. But yeah, for my wife and I, ours is typically like, an hour. That, we've adapted at different points, but an hour. And I think you can reserve the right to, in the midst of a conflict, if it's a more serious fight, to adapt that. But it is difficult to communicate. So if it's like after the hour is up, if you're going to resume again, you can say, actually, I need another hour. I need to do 2 hours now. So it's not a perfect system, but it's a helpful tool to be able to navigate that conflict. But yeah, so just experiment with it and change it until it works. And if it stops working, change it again until it works again. Does that help? Cool, thanks. Hey. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So basically it's like, how do you build those relationships with healthy marriages, with healthy couples? There's different tactics you could use. Obviously starting from afar, like you recognize, wow, these people seem to have a really beautiful marriage. You don't always know what goes on behind closed doors, of course, but when you identify that, like for example, there were some families when I went to college that I saw that were like had really beautiful marriages, and so I would usually try to form a relationship with one of the spouses. Typically for me, it was the man. I would try to get to know the husband and build a relationship that way. And you could be indirect if you have that opportunity, like you go to the same church or again they're your professor or something. You could build that relationship that way. That's what I did. One of my professors, I would just visit him sometime, ask him questions, get his advice. He would ask him to be somewhat of a mentor. Or you can go the route and just be really direct and say, hey, I really admire you. I admire you and your wife. I admire you and your spouse. You seem to have a really beautiful marriage. I come from a family where that wasn't true, unfortunately. And so I want a beautiful marriage, and I was just wondering, like, would you kind of take me under your wing, like mentor me? We do this in other areas of life, whether it's like with finances or fitness or our careers. We have mentors. And so in the same way, we can do that when it comes to marriage and family life. And so, yeah, so you can straight out answer. You can straight up ask them that question, and they can give you an answer. And maybe they're at a point in life where they can't do that, but so often what I've found is they will. So another family that the Kellers, I don't know if you know the Kellers actually, Ben, but they're just so beautiful. They just have a really, really beautiful marriage. And so what I would do is I would stay in touch with the husband from time to time. He's just a good man. And from time to time, I would try to go over to their house, just to see them, to have dinner with them, bring them food, whatever. And again, just seeing their example was so helpful. So there's different things. It's like building, I guess, any relationship. Find some common ground, spend some time together, and then you can be more intentional, asking them to take you under their wing. And again, that's been so helpful for me as well. Does that help? Cool. Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Well, yeah. One more. Yeah. Yeah, good question. He does have a lot of content. He has courses and books. I don't remember the title of his main book, but you can find it online. I know he has a ton on like Amazon, for example. But yeah, good question. I don't know if he has necessarily the perfect inverse, but he does have a lot of tactics that you can use to resolve conflict well. That timeout tactic, I think, might have come from the Gottman Institute. So if you just search Gottman Institute, they have like one really extensive course when it comes to handling conflict, and then some other resources as well. But yeah, I'm sure you could reverse engineer. I mean, when it comes to criticism, instead of attacking someone's character, you just stay focused on the actions. And one of the things that I didn't include it in this talk, but one of the things that psychologists say is like when you're communicating, again, similar to the parent question before, when you're communicating some issue in a relationship, try to make it more about yourself. You can say, hey, when this happens, I feel this, and that's why it has this bad outcome. And so that's one of the things that I've learned too from the advice of people like Gottman. It's like, just communicate how that affects you, make it more about you than them. Because if you say, you make me so angry when you do this, when you leave your clothes all over the floor, it's like, well, they're probably not going to want to change anything about their behavior if you're attacking them. So that would be just one tip on the criticism point. But yeah, jumping through those, I think defensiveness and stonewalling, those are a bit late in the game. I don't know, you want to kind of prevent those things from happening if they do. But there's even inverses to that, but it does take a lot of self-mastery. Like, it's hard. It can be hard in conflict. This is one thing I've struggled with, especially seeing my parents not handle conflict well. And they would be the first one to tell you this, by the way, it's really hard when someone's like bringing up an imperfection about you not to get defensive. But if you can be humble in that moment and just listen, and then later you can maybe explain yourself a little bit if your spouse is open to hearing that, saying, well, hey, I actually wasn't trying to do something wrong here. I thought it was helping, or I thought this was good. But in that moment, it's not always the best to, explain yourself. You might just need to kind of swallow your pride a little bit, take ownership of what happened, and then, make some corrections on it. But it's all about humility. It's hard. It's not easy. But does that help? Awesome. Any final questions? Cool. Thanks for spending so much time. I hope that was helpful, guys. And yeah, again, I'll be happy to chat afterward if you guys want to, but really appreciate you being here. Thanks, everyone online.